Good to see everyone this morning. If you'll turn with me to Luke, the 18th chapter. Luke chapter 18. I don't know about you, but I enjoy comedy. And one of my favorite comedians, he has some really good material, is a fellow by the name of Jeff Foxworthy. He resides over, I think, in Atlanta, Georgia, and he has a good southern wit about him. And can anyone tell me his theme that he is famous for? Might be a redneck. That's right. He talks about you might be a redneck. I last night was able to get on the internet, and we have folks that watch internet. We appreciate their listening audience and being able to see us from time to time. And I got on there and I was listening, and I wrote just a few of the things down that I wanted to share with you. He said, if you have a complete set of salad bowls and they all say Cool Whip on the side, you might be a redneck. If you've ever been accused of lying through your tooth, you might be a redneck. If you have ever used your ironing board as a buffet table, you might be a redneck. If you think a quarter horse is that ride in front of Walmart, you might be a redneck. If you think fast food is defined by hitting a deer at 50 miles an hour, you might be a redneck. If your Barbie house has a clothesline in the front yard, you might be a redneck. If an episode of Walker, Texas Ranger has changed your life, you might be a redneck. And I love this one here. If you've ever had something in your teeth and you pulled them out to see what it is, you might be a redneck. If you've ever stared at a can of orange juice because it said concentrate, you might be a redneck. You know, it's kind of funny how that some of these things don't fall too far from the tree, do they? When it's all said and done. And over in Luke chapter 18 in verse 9, Jesus says this right here. I want you to listen to what he says. He says, and he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. Now, the parable that we're going to talk about this morning is a parable to the response of just what Luke said. Now, what was Jesus thinking when he tells this parable that we're going to study this morning? Well, I want to read from the Amplified Bible. It says, he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves and were confident that they were righteous, that they were upright and in right standing with God, and scorned and made nothing of all the rest of men. In other words, they looked around and they saw people and they said, you know, I'm better than him. And for that reason, then I think I'm better than you. I don't even look at you. I view you with scorn or contempt. Now, with the same theme of Jeff Foxworthy, in which he says, if you do this, then you might be a redneck, let's look at it from a spiritual perspective. And the spiritual perspective is, who is Jesus talking to? Okay, let's think about that. All right, with that in mind, you might be in this parable. He may be talking to you if you have looked at people who don't go to church and you think you're better than they are because they don't go to church. He might be talking to you. He may be talking to you in this parable if you look at prisoners and you think you're better than they are because you're not a prisoner. Jesus might be talking to you. If you look at people who have made some bad moral decisions, bad financial decisions, who suffer from addictions, and you feel that you are better than they are, Jesus might be talking to you. If you've looked at people who don't dress like you, who don't smell like you, and you think that you're better than them because they're struggling with some type of sin or they're struggling with a lack of faith in their life, and you don't have those struggles, and you can do better, and because of that you look down upon them, Jesus might be talking to you. Now, we're in a series on snapshots. I brought a few snapshots this morning. I know kind of by the eye of faith you have to look, and if you see here, this is a picture. You may not can see everything in it. I don't know, Matthew, with your sharp eyes, Dylan, with your, can you see this picture? Can't see it, but you tell I've got a picture. I'll tell you who is in it. It's me, and it is my son and one of my sons-in-law, and 2, 3 of my grandchildren. I can kind of identify with who is in this picture. Now here's another snapshot, and this is a snapshot of me and 3 of my grandboys. So, you know, each one of us are identified. Again, if you look at this snapshot, this is a picture, and it's got Amanda, and it's got me, and it's got Amy, and it's got Tom and Melissa. That's Paul's mom and dad. That's the other grandparents. And Rhett and Asa when he won the Hockey League's most valuable player last year, that trophy. And so you see, when you take a snapshot, you pretty well can identify the characters, the people who are in the snapshot, can't you? Well, you see, when Jesus tells parables, he is giving us a snapshot of the kingdom of heaven, and he said, if you'll look real closely, you're going to be able to find the characters, just like in a picture, of who Jesus is talking about. And this morning, Jesus is asking a question that, for me, it kind of makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because as we look at this, in this imaginary picture that Jesus is going to paint, he is going to tell me who is right with God. That's what it's all about. It's a picture of who is right with God. Now, that's what this picture is all about. I mean, it's not me saying that. I'm not coming to the conclusion. I'm going to let Jesus say it. Hal, we just don't tell me what it means. Just tell me what it says, okay? Right now, Jesus is going to tell us who is right with God, and we're all in this snapshot somewhere. Every one of us is like a big picture of a congregation or a big picture of a group of people, and you can identify each person in it. Well, that's what this parable is all about. And the key takeaway, I want to go ahead and give you the key takeaway this morning, because it is so vital and important, and that is the lesson that we want to learn is that when you look up to God, you will never look down on others. When you look up to God, you will never look down on others. Why? Because you cannot look in 2 directions at the same time. Amen? You cannot look in 2 directions at the same time. And so let's look at, and to make this real easy, there are 2 ways that we can look at ourselves, and this is the way we look at ourselves, one of 2 ways every day. And the way that we look at ourselves is going to determine how God looks at us. That's what Jesus is going to tell us right here in this parable. He's going to say those very words, that how you look at people is how my Father is going to look at you. And so, number 1, Jesus says that you can see yourself comparatively. Look in verses 10 and 11. I'll read verse 9 to kind of begin the thought. And he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves and that they were righteous, and viewed others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Now that's kind of the 2 extremes. You've got the Pharisee on one side, who was the most religious people of that day. He went to church every time the door was open. When it was time to pray, he prayed. He blessed every meal. He gave of everything that he had. He studied his Bible. He did all that he ought to do in his mind and all that he could do. And on the other end is a tax collector who is an opportunist. You see, here's one man who is a giver to God and another man who is a taker from men. He is a taker. That is, he exacts taxes from people. He extracts those taxes from people, and a lot of times he'll extract more than he should to pad his own pocket. Jesus says we've got two extreme players that are in this picture. One's a Pharisee, a religious person. The other is a miserable sinner, a tax collector. You don't get any worse than being a tax collector. This was a Jew that had turned on his own people. And so these two men go to the temple to pray. In verse 11, the Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Now, can you just imagine this, that this man goes and first off, he separates himself from the rest of the folks. You remember, we're talking about people who viewed themselves as being right before God because of the things that they did and how they thought about the world. And they kind of viewed themselves as being separate and apart from everybody else. And so he stood off away from everyone else and he began to pray. He said, I'm not like you. You know, that's a big attitude that I have a hard time with. I look at people in line and I go, I'm not like you. I go down the road and I see somebody, I go, I'm not like you. You know what this man is doing? That's the religious attitude that he's got. It's a self-righteous attitude. I'm not like you. And he says that it goes on to really, it's like he goes to the side and he reaches into his bag and he pulls out a mirror and he looks at that mirror and he begins to sing, How Great Thou Art. Isn't that right? You know what he's doing? In his prayer, he said, Lord, while I'm thinking about it, let's just sing a verse of How Great Thou Art, as he's looking at himself in the mirror. And he says, now, I'm not like I'm not even like him. He points to this tax collector and he says, boy, I'm so glad I'm not like him. I fast twice a week. I pray. I pay tithes of all that I get. Now, here's this man that he is kind of comparing himself with this tax collector. And he says, I'm not like the swindlers of the world. I'm not like the adulterers of the world. I'm not like the thieves of the world. I'm not like the liars of the world. I'm not like the unfaithful of the world. I'm not like those who struggle with their faith. I'm not like those folks who don't go to church. I'm not like those folks who have a problem with addiction. I'm not like those people who are struggling with doubt and disbelief. And I am so glad that I am not like them. And have you ever noticed that whenever we begin to compare ourselves with other folks, what do we generally do? We pick out somebody that, because frankly, it's a lot easier for me to spot your deficiencies than it is to spot mine. And I can always find somebody that's worse off than I am. And so I can look at them and go, boy, I sure am glad I'm not like him. I sure am glad that I'm not like her. Isn't that what's going on here? Isn't that what's happening? Yeah, shake your head. Yeah, that's what's happening. That's the attitude that he has. And let me ask you this. Is there anybody that you have contempt for? Whew. Now, let's be honest. Is there somebody that you look at it just makes your blood boil? Boy, You see, that's what this Pharisee was doing. He would look at other people and he would have just contempt for them. He would look down upon them. He's like the racial Pharisee that says, boy, I sure am glad that I'm not like those old minorities. He's like the social Pharisee that says, I sure am glad that I'm not like those old poor people over there that fight and struggle and they stink and they don't have money for for the better things of life, and they don't smell like I do because they can't afford Dial soap. They have to determine if they're going to buy food or buy soap, and of course they're going to buy food with it. And so they go around with dirty clothes. I sure am glad that I'm not like those old people over there. Yeah, I'm just a social Pharisee. I'm a racial Pharisee. I'm an intellectual Pharisee. What does an intellectual Pharisee say? Boy, I sure am glad I'm not like those old poor people who have to dig ditches and work over here and do this kind of work and this kind of manual labor. And I'm so glad that I've got an education, and I'm not like them. And you know, they're even pagan Pharisees. What does pagan Pharisees say? I sure am glad I'm not like that bunch of hypocrites that go to church down there at Bearwallow. See, they're even pagan hypocrites, pagan Pharisees. And so you see, they look at others with contempt. And he tells God, number one, who he is not. He says, I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not an adulterer, I'm not a liar, and I'm not like that old tax collector. But then he secondly tells God who he is. God, I'm the fella who fast. What did he say about fasting? Notice that what he says here. I fast twice a week. Now, the Jew was to fast on 3 holidays. That's all God said that he wanted them to do, was fast on 3 holidays. Now, that would be you'd fast 3 times a year. Okay, the Pharisees would fast 2 days before the holiday, fast on the holiday, and then fast 2 days after the holiday. So they fasted 15 times a year. Now, the true Pharisee fasted 15 times a year, but how many times a year did this man fast? 104 times a year, 33.5% more than the most religious folks. He said, I tithe of all that I have. You realize in the Old Testament, the Bible only commands the Jews to tithe off 3 things: their grain, their oil, and their wine. You go back and you check, and there's only 3 things that they fast over. But what does this man say? Well, if I grow a garden and I pick leaves, I pick those cumin leaves, I'm going to fast. I'll count out 10, give 1 to God. Count out 10, give 1 to God. If I have those anise seeds, I'll count out 10 little seeds, I'll give 1 to God. If I have a yard sale, I'm going to tithe. If I get a birthday present, I'm going to tithe. If I get a bonus at work, I'm going to tithe. You see, he sounds like a really religious person, doesn't he? Doesn't he sound like the good guy here? Doesn't he sound like the guy wearing the white hat? He says, I don't fast just 3 times a year, which God commands. I don't fast like the Pharisees that fast 15 times a year. I fast 104 times a year, and I tithe not only of the oil and the wine and the grain, but I fast of everything. But what was the problem? Well, see, here's a man who is proud. He's proud and he's loud. He thinks he's right with God for 2 reasons. He thinks he's right with God for, number 1, what he has done. And then number 2, he thinks he's right with God for what he has not done. What he has not done. You see, rather than looking in the mirror and singing the song, How Great Thou Art, he should have been singing Carly Simon's song, You're So Vain. Isn't that right? Isn't that the problem that he had right here? He looked in the mirror and he thought he could pull off something that you cannot pull off. And you know what that is? You cannot look in 2 different directions at the same time. You cannot look up to God and look down on people. You cannot do that. It kind of reminds me of the little 5th grade girl who came home and she was so excited. She says, Mommy, you'll never believe it. I was voted the prettiest girl in class. Well, the next day she comes home and she says, Mom, you're not going to believe this. Today they took a vote and I was the smartest kid in my room. The next day she came home and she was just beaming and she says, you're not going to believe this, but I won the girl most likely to succeed. The next day she comes home and she's just bawling her eyes out and her mother says, what's wrong? And she says, well, we had another election today. And she said, did you lose? And she says, no, I won. Well, what was it? The most stuck up person in class. You see, that's kind of the way this man is. He suffered from two problems. So you see, he first had a problem, what I call I problem. You realize that 5 times he uses the personal pronoun I. I don't do this, I don't do that, I do this, I do this, I do that. And he suffered from two problems. Number one, the problem of inflation and the problem of deflation. Number one, he inflated his own self-worth. See, Jesus didn't say here that he was worth all he was saying. He inflated himself and he deflated everybody around him. Everybody around him. And you see, these problems here are something that not only can happen at an individual level, but it can happen at a corporate level as well. We can be too good to serve others individually. We can be too good to reach the community as a congregation. We can suffer as a church from inflation and deflation. We can suffer as individuals, inflation, deflation. And so I love a quote from C.S. Lewis. I know some of you read C.S. Lewis. He was a great Christian writer. He said, a proud man is always looking down on things and people, but as long as you're looking down, you cannot see anything above you. You know, we shouldn't compare ourselves with others at all because 2 reasons. Don't compare yourself. Don't look at people comparatively. Number one, if you look at people and you compare yourself to them and you feel like you're better off than they are, that produces pride. If you compare yourself with somebody that you think is better off than you, that will develop and fill your heart with bitterness. I mean, how many relationships and friendships have been destroyed because I felt like somebody got more than I did, and I deserved it, but they got it. What about sibling rivalry? A lot of times it's what? Well, compare, well, what mama did for you, but she didn't do that for me. Isn't that right? And so he says, don't look at yourself comparatively. Number 2, you need not only to see yourself. This man made the mistake of seeing himself comparably, but the second man in verse 13 saw himself correctly. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful on me, a sinner. This was a man who saw himself correctly. Now, let me ask you a question. If the Pharisee and the tax collector were to come into our building this morning and they were to walk through those back doors, where do you think that the Pharisee would come and sit? That's right. Right down front, where everybody could see what he has done. Where would the tax collectors be? He would be back there in the far corner hoping that nobody noticed him. As a matter of fact, he's not even sure he wants God to notice him. Isn't that amazing? Well, what a tremendous picture Jesus is painting right here. And the great lesson about this is what? It is about the mercy of God. This is what this whole story is about. It is about the mercy of God. God will not. Now listen to me. Listen to what Jesus says in verse 14. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the others, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. The great lesson is on the mercy of God. God will not give mercy to those who don't think they need it, but He will give mercy to those who think they do need it. The tax collector saw himself correctly. You know when you can see yourself correctly? When you can see God correctly. When you can see God correctly. Listen, only God is good. Only God is perfect. Only God is righteous. Only God is holy. Only God is sinless. And all the good that I can do, whenever I measure it according to the book of Isaiah, it is but filthy rags, he says, comparing it to the righteousness of God. You know what that means? That no matter how good I am, and Jesus isn't saying we shouldn't be lazy and slothful and on our moral capacities. What's he saying? He says, you do all that you can, but remember, that's not what is going to save you. It's God's mercy that saves you. And what does he say to him? He says, the Pharisee walked in and he saw the tax collector and he said, that I am so glad that I am not like you. The tax collector came in and he looked at the Pharisee and he said, I'm glad you're not like me. I wish I were not like me. Boy, it sure does get close to home, doesn't it? My goodness. Only one person receives mercy here. It was the one who asked for it. Pharisee didn't need it. He didn't think. Only the tax collector cried out, Lord, have mercy on me. You know the word mercy that is used here by Jesus, there's a footnote in my Bible because this is not the normal Greek word for mercy. It is a word that comes from the Hebrew. It is the Hebrew word kapor. Kapor this word comes from an old Hebrew phrase, Yom Kippur. Anybody know what Yom Kippur is? Day of Atonement. The word Kippur means covering. Because on the Day of Atonement, they covered the Ark of the Covenant with blood. And that's what Jesus is saying here, that the tax collector said, Lord, I get it. I need covering. I understand why the lamb's got to die. I understand why your son's got to go to the cross. But the Pharisee didn't get it. He was religious. But he did not ask for mercy. In verse 14, finally he says, you can see yourself clearly. You know, I'm sure I've read this story probably 1,000 times. And you would have, just as with the people of that day, when Jesus begins this story and said there was a Pharisee that went up to pray and he said this, this, and this, and then a tax collector came in and he said this. Now, let me ask you the vote. Who's the good guy here? Everybody would have cheered and said, it's the Pharisee. He gives more. He tithes more. He prays more. He doesn't do this. He doesn't do that. He's the good guy here. And Jesus says, you're wrong. Because the issue is not about self-righteousness. The issue is about mercy. In verse 14, he says, I tell you, this man went to his house, what? Justified. You know what the word justified means? Justified is a state that God declares on you. It's not something you work out. See, mercy is not something that God gives you in reward for what you have done. It is something that God gives you because you recognize you're needing it and you ask for it. Now, I kind of want to close out because, see, this Luke 18, let me just tell you, folks, this parable right here gets me every time. It does. It gets me every time. Because I do what many of you have done in the last 15 or 20 minutes. A lot of times I say, boy, I sure am glad I'm not like that Pharisee. Gotcha. Isn't that right? See the attitude there? I sure am glad I'm not like that Pharisee. Guess what? If you said that, you are. You just said the very thing he said. Man, do I have to guard my heart. What a snapshot. Once there was a king. I'll close out with this right here. I'm sorry for running over this morning, but this is such a tremendous lesson right here. There was a king who brought in all of his great people that worked for him, and he had this big dining hall set up, and of course the king's got his chair at the front, and then the table ran outward, and he tells everybody, I want you to determine where you ought to sit, how important you feel you are, and how important you feel you are for me, and you set accordingly. And then he left the room. And so everybody kind of discussed it. And so the one said, well, you know, I'm pretty important, so I'll sit at the right. Then one sat to the left, and then down the pecking order they went. And then finally the king came back in, and he went to the head where his chair was. He picked his plate up, and he walked down to the other end, and he sat down there. See, that's the point Jesus is making this morning. We're all in this together. We all need mercy. This morning, do you need the cleansing blood of the Lamb in your life? This morning, do I need to remember that I need God's mercy? If you need to put your Lord on in baptism, won't you come as we stand and sing?